What's going on, guys? My name is Mike Sabo, and today we're going to build this KTM 350 engine. Now, this particular engine is a 2018 KTM 350 XCF, but the procedures in this video should help you out with the 2016 to 2019 KTM 350 XCF and the SXF. Now, this may also apply to the Husqvarna versions, which are the FC 350 and the FX 350. Now, there may also be similarities with the EXCF version from KTM, and also there may be some variants of the Gas, which also were known to have the same engines as the KTM. Now, with all that being said, please do your own research before following this tutorial to build your engine, but the point I'm making is that this video could help you through a multitude of engine builds. Now that we've covered that, before we get into this engine build, I always like to mention that I am not a certified technician. I did not go to a trade school or anything like that. I've built the knowledge of engine building from 20 years of experience of working with small motors and putting things together and making engines run. I've done quite a few of them, and I'm pretty damn good at what I do, but I do like to make that disclaimer before you start following the instructions in these videos. So these videos are for reference only. I highly recommend you get yourself a service manual. This is a hard copy of the KTM service manual. If you're in the KTM game, you're probably familiar that KTM stopped making physical manuals for their dirt bikes. Now, that being said, you can actually get this physical copy. There's a distributor on eBay that prints them out. I like having a physical copy. I just think, I don't know if I'm just old school or what, but I do like to have that. I will have the link in the description below to get a manual like this one. If you want to follow along with the KTM OEM manual, in the right side of the screen, I will have the section of the manual that we are currently working on throughout the entire video. I'll also have all tools and products listed in the description below, as well as chapters, so that if you want to jump to different sections of a specific part of the engine that you're struggling with, that'll all be in the description of this video. And one last thing before we get started, if this video helps you out in any way, shape, or form, please share this video, and also remember to give me a thumbs up. That helps me out tremendously, and consider subscribing to this channel for more content like this. There is an entire build series where you can see this KTM 350 being rebuilt from start to finish. This particular engine was blown up by a local racer. I received it as a basket case, and we did a total restoration. That's a pretty awesome build, and I definitely think you should check it out. Anyways, let's get into building this KTM 350 engine. I'm going to try to keep everything as organized as possible using these plastic trays for each section of the engine that I'm building. And I've also got all my parts laid out on the bench kind of in order, and that's going to be really satisfying to see that slowly disappear as we build this engine. First thing we're going to do is our center cases. Before we get started, I want to go over the case halves and how to load them up. So just in case you have all this stuff stripped, like your bearings and all these little stays and your oil hoses and stuff, I'll show you where everything goes. Most of the time, a lot of this stuff is not going to have been removed. You'll also notice that these cases look brand spanking new. These are the original takeoff cases. I had them sent to Motoblast. They do vapor blasting there. They come back looking brand spanking new. I would actually consider these better than new because it's a little less porous. The finish lasts a really long time. You'll also notice all of my hardware has brand new yellow zinc coating. This is the original hardware. James at Motoblast does the vapor blasting, and he can also zinc coat your bolts. Plus, you can get it in different colors and add a little bit of a custom touch to your engine. Anyways, as far as the bearings go, if you're not going to replace any of the bearings, I would at least replace your crank bearing. It's just a good idea to do that. They're not terribly expensive. For the other bearings, you want to make sure that they're all good to go. It is good to replace those too. If not, though, just make sure they're lubricated and that they all roll nice and smoothly. Now, for the bearings on this half, you have a stay here, and a stay here. Now you want to make sure with these little Torx bolts, see these tiny little Torx bolts in here? I like to put a little bit of blue Loctite, or if you're going to use red Loctite, which you can do safely, but you have to use just a very small dot, like a little speck of it on there, and that actually works really well. But I would put some sort of thread locker on those. You've also got two stays right here on your main bearing. Now there's going to be bearings on the other side too, but before we get to the other side, I want to show you there's some oil jets on these engines too. So we have this one right here. It's held on by a little Allen bolt. It's a little oil jet for the piston. And if we flip around to this side, you'll see I've got my crank seal in place, and there is also a small post right here, which I didn't even remove from my engine, and you can see there's a stay plate right next to it and a little bolt, and again that gets just a small amount of Loctite. Now there's an oil jet right here, if you guys can see that, And this is a size 150. I'm letting you guys know the sizes because in the service manual, it is not in there. I had some difficulty finding these. And then there's a jet right here. That is a size 100. Now for the other side of the engine, it's a little bit more simple. We've got our crank bearing here. We've got the stay on top and on bottom. Over here, these two bearings for the transmission do not have any stays. There is a small jet right here for the piston. That is a size 50. And then, of course, you've got the two studs up top, and there are two little dowel pins that go right next to them. And if we flip around to the other side, there is another jet right in here. That is a size 60. And of course, I've got the crank seal in place, as well as our countershaft seal and our seal for our shift shaft. All right, let's go ahead and put our crank in place. I'm going to be using this Maxima assembly lube. You can use whatever assembly lube that you prefer. I'm just putting a little bit of lube in here. I've already gone around and put a small amount of lubricant on all of my bearings to begin with. But you just want to make sure that you're not putting this stuff in dry. Now we're going to drop our crank in place. We're going to make sure your crank is good to go and nice and tight. I had mine rebuilt by Power Sports Nation using a brand new rod right from Wassner. So this should be good to go. I've also pressed on the inner races for our crank bearings. There is a special tool to do that. You can find a video, I think Rocky Mountain has one that shows how to change those out. Mine are already in place. You want to put a little bit of lubricant on them because sometimes they don't want to go in super smooth. They're pretty tight tolerances. And the way we're putting this in is with the spline portion facing downward. The tapered portion will be facing upward. We're going to take our rod and face that up where the cylinder goes. If you don't do that, it's going to hit the walls of your case. So we'll take this. I've also got some lubricant on the bearing itself, and the wood boards are necessary here because if you're not using an engine stand or anything, as you drop this down, you need to have some space for the crank to slide through the other end. And sometimes these don't just pop right in place. You got to roll them and spin them, and they will eventually go flat against the bearing. Next, we're going to put the transmission in. You want to make sure that your transmission is good to go. All of your gears are nice and good, no cracks or chipped teeth or anything. And you also want to check the dogs, which are those little square portions that lock into the gears. You want to make sure that they're not rounded out or excessively glossy. That can sometimes mean that they're on their way out. If your gears are popping out of place or something, that's something you definitely want to check. Now, as far as putting the transmission together, it's not as difficult as it looks. You want to go through, make sure that all of your gears and shims and everything are in the right order. There's usually a schematic like this in the service manual, or you can look it up. It's really not that difficult to do. Even if the transmission is entirely apart, they just slide together step by step. So you want to make sure all that stuff is good to go, or you're going to have shifting problems. Now we're going to put the transmission halves in together. Since we're doing it on blocks facing downward, we have to be careful. There is a washer on the bottom of the one transmission shaft right here. And to prevent that from falling off, I'm going to use the grease trick. I'm just going to take a little bit of grease and put it on the bearing or the washer and pop it on here. And that grease will hold that washer in place so that when we go upside down, we don't have to worry about that popping off and being out of place, because it's important that we have that there. That's basically going to act as a shim. We're going to come over here now and mesh our transmission together. Feels good. And we'll be popping it in like this. Usually we can just drop this stuff in place. I'm going to hold on to these gears so they don't fall off. And just finding the hole. It doesn't always just pop into place easily. Sometimes you gotta play with it a little bit. Oh, there we go. Sometimes you just gotta spin it around and then finally it'll pop into place. And just give this thing a good inspection. You wanna make sure your gears are nice and seated, and you can see these top two gears are pretty much flush with each other. That is a good sign. And I also wanted to point out that there's a washer on the top of this shaft. So you just want to make sure that that's in place as well. Now we're going to put the shift forks in place. There are 3 forks, and just to show you the difference, the number 1 has a smaller opening. That's this one right here. This one is going to go to the left,
And it's a good idea to put a little bit of lubricant on these if you haven't already. And there will be a slot that this fits into, like so. And we want to face it like this with the pin right here. That pin is going to go right into our shift drum. Now the number 2 and number 3 fork have the same size forks. However, they are slightly different. If you look at them like this, you can see that the pin is right in line with the fork on this one, and on this one it's offset. So number 2 is going to be this one with the pin in line with the fork. We will place this in the bottom of the shaft on the right with the pin facing this way. And next we've got fork number 3, again with the pin facing this way. And we will just slide that right in here. Now we're going to put the shift drum in place. I've already gone ahead and put some lubricant in all of the channels of this thing. To make it a little bit easier to get it in here, you want to make sure that all of your shift forks are placed to the side. And I think this one actually will be easier if you place it inward. And then this one down here, you can see it's hitting up against the case. So if you actually lift this up a little bit, then you should be able to slide it over and rest it on top of the bearing. So you can see we've got a good amount of space now. We're going to do this with the black plastic portion facing upward. This portion is going to face downward. And we need to guide our pins into these slots. And this is one of those spots, you just want to kind of take your time and make sure you get everything in the right location. Now I'm going to take the pins and just guide them into our shift drum. Then we've got these 2 shift rails. We've got a short one and a long one. The short one is going to go on the single fork, and the long one is going to go on the side with 2 forks. And of course you want to put some lubricant on these. We're just going to slide it into our shift fork, line it up with the pocket in the hole, or in the case. And that pops in like so. Last one. Slide this in here. Just make sure your forks are lined up. Pops right into the case like so. Now we're getting ready to do the case halves. You want to make sure you have all of your hardware ready to go, because when the case sealer starts drying, you don't want to be searching for the bolts at that point in time. So I've already got a little bit of anti-seize already on all of my threads, and I've also got 4 different dowel pins. You just want to make sure you have these ready to rock and roll before you start working with your sealant. And we're also going to take a little bit of anti-seize and just prepare the dowel pins right away. These can be a pain in the ass to get out if you don't put anti-seize on them. So sometimes they're still a pain in the ass even with the anti-seize, but at least you have a fighting chance if you put the anti-seize on them now. We'll just kind of roll it around the outside and get all of these ready to rock and roll. We're getting ready to put the other case half on. You want to make sure that your gasket surface is nice and clean. A good idea is to take some lacquer thinner or anything that's going to break down grease and just wipe away the outside. I've already gone ahead and cleaned mine up. I've also surfaced this on a surfacing stone. You want to make sure you don't have any like gouges or anything in your case, because you might end up getting some leaks. So we're going to put gasket sealer on the engine. I'm not going to the procedure in the manual. The manual wants you to do one side, and I'm also going to be using a different sealant. I'm going to be using Yamabond 6B. It's just the Yamaha version of sealant, and I've been using this stuff forever. It's my favorite sealant to use. You can use whatever sealant you prefer. I typically go with ones that are gas resistant for power sports. And the way that I do this is you just kind of start to go around the outside, and I do the dab technique with my finger, and that kind of helps you put down a nice even layer of sealant. And you just want to make sure that you take your time here, go around and get all of the areas. You don't need to put a ton of this stuff on here, but we are going to do both case halves, and just make sure you have an even thickness all the way around. It's okay if you get like a little bit on your crank or on your gears and stuff. It's not going to hurt anything. This stuff is real soft even when it dries. It'll just kind of get, either stay on the inside of your engine, or it'll circulate through the oil and come out on the next oil change. But unless you're putting like globs of it inside the engine, you don't really have to worry about it. And to get into these little areas here, it can be kind of tricky. I'm going to use a Q-tip, and I'm just going to rotate the crank to this little open portion to help get it on here. All right, now we've got 4 dowel pins to put in place. We've got 2 of these small ones. One is going to go right here. And then there is a second one that's going to go on the opposite side of the cylinder right here. And we've got a medium-sized one that's going to go up front right here. And in the back, we've got a larger one. Before I drop that case on, I'm going to put plenty of lubricant on our inner race for the crank, and we'll also put some on our transmission also. Hopefully that'll help it pop into place, because sometimes these things can be stuck. I'm going to try to do this without making a mess. Just going to line everything up. You may have to rotate the crank to get it to go onto the crank bearing. Just going to give this very gentle taps. See if we can get it seated. You don't want to beat on this thing, and you definitely don't want to pull it together with the bolts. Before we go any further, we'll roll our crank around, make sure it's good and smooth. If it's a little bit tight, that's okay. Sometimes that's just the new crank seals. Mine feels good and smooth, so I think we're ready to rock and roll. Now we've got 3 different length case bolts. To figure out where they go, it's pretty easy to do. We're going to go over to the computer, and we're going to go on Scott Power Sports. They've got an OEM parts portal here, and if you go to the engine cases, you can see the side profile of the engine, and they've got different numbers for each of the bolts. So they've got 21, 22, and 23. And if you go over to the parts, you see 21. It says it's an M6 by 55. That's 55 millimeters. The 22 is 65, and the 23 is 70. So you could measure those with a pair of calipers, or you could just put the shorter ones are going to be the 55s, the mediums are going to be the 65s, and the long ones are going to be the 70s. So I'm going to drop all these in place. And I'm just going to run these in with the impact driver. I do not recommend using an impact if you're not handy with one of these. This Milwaukee one is really nice because it's got adjustments for the torque. And if you set it on number 1, it's very, very soft, maybe around 5 foot-pounds. I'm just using this to run them all down, though. We'll torque them in a minute. The safest way to do this is by hand. This is just quicker. And we're going to go in a crisscross pattern as we're doing this. Now we'll torque these down. Same thing as before. We're going to go in a crisscross pattern. We're going to go to 7.4 foot-pounds. And once I think I have them all, I like to go around the outside and just do a perimeter check because it's easy to forget one. Here's one right here that I forgot. And once again, this is a good point to stop and make sure your crank rolls free. If it doesn't roll free, you might have pinched something or done something wrong. It's a good time to stop and check it out. This one feels good. Now, this is an unnecessary step, but I like to clean up the gasket material. The best way to do that is to let it dry, and then we can come back and scrape it off. So I'm going to let this sit for at least an hour, and then we'll be back. All right, guys, a couple hours have gone by, so the old fingernail actually works pretty well at just scratching this stuff off. You can see how easily it comes off once it's dry. Otherwise, it's going to smear all over the place if you try to do it a different way. If you don't want to use your finger, you can use a plastic razor. It's kind of like the more fancy way of doing it. And these plastic razors are super cheap too. I'll have these linked in the description below. You just kind of peel this stuff away. You can see that cleans up really nicely. All right, now we're going to take our engine and turn it around to the clutch side. And on the opposite side of our countershaft right here, there's a small groove. We're going to put this clip in place. It's recommended that you put a new clip on here, but if you have to, you can usually get away with reusing the old one as long as it's not stretched out, because if it doesn't have the original spring retention, then it's not going to function properly and be able to do its job. I'm going to make sure that's seated all the way in the groove. Now we're going to spin back around and move right here. We're going to put the oil drain plug in place. It goes up here. Here is the plug. It has a magnet on it if you're using the OEM one. We've also got a brand new crush washer on there. Just going to put this in place. And this gets tightened down to 14.8 foot-pounds. Then we've got another drain plug right here. This gets an O-ring. You want to make sure that you got a good O-ring on there, or just replace it. It's a pretty cheap part. So we're just going to put this right under here, spin it in place. This is going to go to 11.1 foot-pounds. Now we've got our oil screen to put in place. You want to make sure this thing is good and clean, or if it's messed up, you want to replace it. There's also an O-ring on either side. You want to go ahead and replace those as well, or at least make sure they're in good condition. Putting a little bit of lubricant on there, and it's going to stretch across the cases and fit into a little depression on the other side of the case. You've got to get it in there, and then it just pops into place. Then we've got another plug that's going to go right on top of our filter. There is an O-ring on this. You want to make sure that's in good condition or replace it. I'm going to put a little bit of anti-seize on this. And that gets tightened to 11.1 foot-pounds. And then we're going to roll this around, and we're going to do our oil check valve. That's going to go right in here. And we've got a ball bearing and a spring, and then we've got an aluminum plug. I got a brand new crush washer on there. This is going to go in with the ball bearing going in first, followed by the spring, and then put the plug in place. And this is also going to go to 11.1 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to put our oil filter in. We've got a brand new OEM KTM oil filter. This is pretty legit. You can check this thing out. It even has KTM printed right there. We're going to put it in with the rubber side facing inward. Before we put it in, the manual wants you to put a little bit of oil in the housing. I'm not really sure this is necessary. It's probably just to help it for the first startup so that it's not completely dry in there. It says to fill it about 1/3 of the way full. So I'm just going to pour a little bit of oil in here. That should be plenty. Of course, we're making a mess. And we've got an aluminum cover here. And I put a brand new Viton O-ring on the back here. It's an OEM one. You want to make sure that's in good shape. Good idea to replace that every time you do your filter. So we're just going to go ahead, put this in again with the rubber facing downward. Push this in place, and we can put the plate. And we've got two 16mm bolts. I've got a little bit of anti-seize on both of these. These are going to go to 7.4 foot-pounds of torque. Two last things I want to do, and that should wrap up the center cases. We've got a collar that's going to go onto this side of our crankshaft. It's going to fit into our crank seal. We'll take a little bit of assembly lube and just put it into our seal so that we're not putting this in there dry. And it will pop in with the wider portion facing inward. And we'll just kind of spin that. Make sure you don't roll the lip of your seal. Usually I'll pull it back out just a little bit, and that'll, if it did roll, that will correct any of the portions that are rolled. That is all that we need. Now we'll spin the engine around, and we're going to put a collar on our countershaft. We've got an O-ring that's going to go in place first. I'm putting a little bit of lubricant on here. I did read that these they tend to leak sometimes, so it's common that people will upsize this and make it a little bit thicker. So this is a thicker O-ring than stock. Just something to take into consideration. We're just going to slide this over the splines carefully. You don't want the splines or anything to cut that O-ring. And then we're going to put a little bit of lubricant on the collar. And just like on the other side, just gently push this in and make sure that you don't roll the inner lip of your seal. All right, I think I've got it on there all the way. Now we're going to move on to the shift mechanism. We're going to put our shift shaft in place. This is what it looks like. Make sure you have your spring on there, and there is a washer. It's going to slide on here, and we'll lubricate where the shaft contacts the bearings, and I've already put a little bit of lubricant on the bearings themselves. This will just slide into place like so. Next, we're going to put the shift drum locating unit in there. That's what it's called in the manual. I usually call these the shift star. You can see right here, the 1 point is a little different. That's for neutral. Now you'll notice what it's going to pop onto here. The flat portions are offset. So this can only go on in one way. You can't mess this up. So we're going to line up those portions. We're going to come over here on the shift shaft and just pull back this portion that's spring loaded. And we should be able to push this into place. There we go. We've got a bolt that's going to go in here. I'm going to put just a little bit, well, a lot of bit of blue Loctite on there. And this gets tightened to 7.4 foot-pounds of torque. You might have to roll the drum until it stops. Next, we've got our locking lever, or the shift detent. It's going to go in this way with the little indentation facing the back, and on the inside we've got a small spacer that's going to fit into the detent like so. Then on this side we've got a washer and a bolt that's going to pop through like so. And then we've got a spring. You're going to face that this way, pop it on, and you'll see the spring will go right into that little indentation on the back of the arm. And sometimes this can be a little bit tricky. We're going to put a little bit of blue Loctite on this. And usually what I like to do is try to get this started. You can see the spring goes in the back. And with that started, we can pull this back. We should be able to lock it up like so. And then you just have to make sure that everything is lined up. And then we just want to make sure that this moves nice and freely once it's tightened down. If it doesn't, you may have pinched that little spacer in the back. Next, we're going to be doing the force pump, as the manual refers to it. Really, it's the oil pump. You're going to have a rotor on both sides of the engine. There's going to be this rotor shaft that goes through the engine. You'll see one side has a large hole, the other side has two small holes. For this clutch side, you're going to have the two small holes, but it's going to have to come through the opposite side of the engine, because you'll see this side is a little bit too big. This side will fit through no problem. So we've got to push it through from the opposite side. I'm going to put a little bit of lubricant on the ends of the shaft. So we're going to go in with the two small holes facing inward, and it's just going to go right through this side of the oil pump. Spin it around. You see it'll pop through this side like so. Now we've got our outer and inner rotor. You're going to see a little punch mark on each of the rotors. That is going to face upward. So make sure that punch mark is facing upward. Got a little bit of lubricant on the outside of the pump. That's going to slide in place like that. And then we're going to take this one, same thing with the punch mark facing upward, and it's going to slide onto the shaft. You might have to hold it from the other side from pressing in, and just slide it into the outer rotor. Then we've got a small pin that's going to go into the bottom hole, and we're going to guide that into the inner rotor. You just have to line it up, and it should press into the rotor like that, and that'll stop the shaft from going any further. And we've got the oil pump cover. You can see there's a little arrow that faces upward. This is going to slide right over the oil pump shaft like that. Put a little bit of blue Loctite on both of these bolts, and these get tightened down to 4.4 foot-pounds of torque. I'm just going to snug them down by hand. Okay. Next is going to go the oil pump gear. This is a critical upgrade depending on what year your bike is. I have the original one right here. This is the takeout, and as you can see, this one failed. These are plastic right from the factory. The OEM ones are plastics. You can see this one, the gears, it looks like they just sheared right off. They're known for warping and just failing. There's a couple of the gears we're going to be replacing. I'll show you all of them. This is a KTM part number. If you go ahead and replace this gear and order it brand new OEM, you'll get the steel one, chances are, unless it's a new old stock one of these. But as far as I know, these are totally obsolete. Nobody uses these. It's a great upgrade, a reliable upgrade to swap out all the plastic gears with these steel ones. So to put this in place, we're going to face it with this groove facing downward. Before we put it on, we're going to slide this pin into our shaft and get it about even if we can. And then this gear should slide right over top of that. And we've got a small washer. It's going to go on top. And then we've got an E-clip that's going to fit into that groove. And as usual, I recommend using a new one of these, but you can reuse the old one as long as it's still in good shape. And we'll just make sure that that's clipped all the way in the groove. You do not want that popping out. Now we're going to put the oil pump idler gear in place. This is another upgraded part. So you can see this is the old part, the old crappy plastic one. And if you look at this one, you can see some of the teeth are indeed damaged. This is why this engine failed in the first place. You can see right here, you can feel it too. They're just chewed up, and like I said, these warp also. So this is trash, and we're gonna pop on this steel one. I'm gonna put a little bit of lube on this shaft. Then we're gonna put on the gear. There's a raised portion that's gonna face inward. Pop this on, line the gear up, and it should sit nice and flush with your oil pump gear. And we've got another washer that's going to go on here. And we'll pop our retaining ring in place. Now we're going to come around to the other side and put the other oil rotor in place. First thing we're going to do is take this pin and slide it through the rotor shaft. Get it about in the middle. And we've got an internal and external rotor, and again, these are a massive upgrade. You want to make sure if you have these crappy plastic ones, upgrade them to the steel. These are the ones that came out. They are very common, very, very common that these fail. So these are junk. We're going to go ahead. These are a KTM part number. And we're going to put this in. You can see there is a slot to face where our shaft goes. There's also a little dimple on the top, as well as on one side of your rotor. We're going to put it in with both of the dimples facing inward. Just going to go ahead and slide that in place. I'm going to put some lube in here, and also on the inside and outside of the outer rotor, just to make sure that everything's got a layer of lubricant on it. And this will slide on like so. Next, we've got an O-ring. It's a good idea to put a brand new one of these in place. It fits into this little channel. Then we've got our cover plate that goes in place with 3 bolts, and all 3 get just a little bit of blue Loctite. And if you want to torque these, they go to 4.4 foot-pounds of torque. I'm just going to snug them down. Next, we're going to put the balancer gear and timing chain in place. So this is going to go into this bearing right here. You want to make sure you got a little bit of lubricant in there. Before we go putting that on there, we've got a brand new timing chain right from KTM. The manual does say if you're reusing your timing chain, to make sure you put it on in the same direction that it came off. So we're going to take our timing chain, run it through our case, kind of make a nice little opening here for it, and we'll take our balancer, kind of fish it around and get it onto the gear. And then it will slide into that bearing like so. I'm going to take the chain and run it over the back for now. And in the front, we've got this little chain guide, and you can see what this looks like. It's going to face this way with the raised portion facing up. And get this in there, we got to lift the balancer up a little bit. I found that if you rolled the balancer to this side, it makes it a little bit easier. You pull the chain up and then just lift the gear out slightly if we can. And we should be able to fish this in here. Okay, there we go. Now that that's in there, we have a bolt here. It's going to get a little bit of blue Loctite. And we'll just spin that in place. This goes to 7.4 foot-pounds of torque. Then we've got another timing chain guide rail that's going to slide in the front like this. And there is a bolt that goes through. And I do have a small amount of blue Loctite on this as well. And this gets tightened to 11.1 foot-pounds. All right, guys, now I actually forgot to put this chain slider in, so you'll notice some of the components are on the engine that we haven't gone over yet. So just disregard that, and as we move forward, you'll see this plastic piece might be missing because I just noticed now that I forgot to put it in. Anyways, this is the next piece that goes in. It is another chain slider that's going to go in the back. You've got a mounting hole at the bottom and a channel right here that the chain runs in. You're going to face it with the channel facing towards your cam chain. It's going to slide down like so. And there is a bolt here with a shoulder on it. I'm going to put a little bit of blue Loctite on it and get it in place. And this is going to get tightened down to 7.4 foot-pounds of torque. Next we have the primary gear. It's important to make sure this is lined up correctly. You can see there's two dimples on the top side that's going to face towards you. And then for the crank, you'll see there is a flat portion right here where the splines are different. So we're going to line that up with our crankshaft. Before we press this in place, you want to line the dimple on your balancer to be between the two dimples on the primary gear. You might have to fidget with this just a little bit to get everything to fit into place. There we go. Just make sure it's sitting nice and flush. I'm going to put some blue Loctite on here. A good bit, and we've got a reverse thread nut, so lefty will be tighty. Just going to tighten this down. We're going to come back and tighten this later once the clutch basket's in place. All right, let's go ahead and put our clutch basket in place. We've got a collar that's going to slide onto our main shaft. There is a wider portion at the bottom that's going to face inward. I'll put a little bit of assembly lube on there, and then we've got a dual row bearing. It's going to go on top, and next is our basket. Put a little bit of lube on there, and we'll slide this in place and just mesh it into the gears of our primary drive gear. You may have to move your oil pump as well. There we go, slid right into place. Then we've got this thick washer. It's going to go next. Then we've got the inner hub that's going to slide on in the middle. Slide that in place like so. Now we've got a lock washer. There is a tang that's already bent from the factory. I do recommend using a new one of these, but you can reuse them, especially if only one of your tabs was bent before. There's a second one on there that you can use. That tang is going to go into this flat portion facing downward. That's going to prevent it from spinning. So we'll slide it on like that. I'm going to put a little bit of blue Loctite on our nut, even though we have that lock washer on there as well. And then we'll put the nut on. And you can see the way this has a smaller portion facing upwards, and on the inside there is a non-threaded portion. That non-threaded portion is going to go on facing inward. And we'll thread this in place. Now we're going to use our clutch holding tool from Tusk. It has kits for your Japanese style bikes, and also has these little pins here that are going to hug the inner hub right on the inside. You don't have to make these super tight. It is more to hold it from rotating, you don't really need it to be clamped down super tight. So we'll just put a little bit of tension on there. Make sure it's in those grooves. All right, we'll lock that down like so. We're going to use the bench as our friend here. It's going to hold the holding tool from spinning, and we're going to go to 73.8 foot-pounds. All right, And then this just releases right off of here. And our inner hub is good. Now we can tighten down that primary gear nut. We're going to use a different method to hold this from spinning. We're going to use the aluminum nail technique, also known as the penny technique. The whole idea of this is you want to use something softer than the gear itself. So if something goes wrong, the aluminum nail will be destroyed and not the gears. So we're going to jam that in there like so, and we're going to be tightening this in a counterclockwise fashion. And depending on your setup, if you're working on the bench, you might want to grab a friend to hold the engine. I'm a little bit too stubborn for that though, so we're just gonna grind through it here. Okay, and that is to 73.8 foot-pounds. And when you're done, you don't want to forget to remove the nails. I actually used 2 nails. Just get them out of there. Oh, otherwise, you know, that could create problems. Next, we're going to build the clutch pack. First thing we want to do is get some oil on our fibers. Now, you guys can use whatever method you want. Some people will do no oil. They put the engine together dry. Other people like to let them soak for an hour. Some people like to set them soak for a week. It's up to you. I like to put a little bit of oil just on the fibers. And by the time this engine gets fired up, this oil will have been absorbed all into the fibers of this clutch. You just kind of put it in a paper plate like this, makes it really easy. You can just toss the paper plate away when you're done. No fuss, no muss. Just going to make sure all of these plates have oil on them. Okay, these have plenty of oil on them, so we can put these like so. And then we've got 2 different styles of plates. These ones are 1 millimeter thick. One is going to go on the bottom and one is going to go on the top of the clutch pack. They have different part numbers on the KTM schematic, but I measured them with a pair of calipers and they are identical in size, so I'm pretty sure that these are interchangeable. You just want to make sure that these thin ones go on, again, the very first plate and the very last plate. Then you have these plates right here, and if you look at them, I'll take one of each. All of the center plates are a little bit thicker. So again, the thin one goes in first and last. Before we start putting the plates and fibers in place, we have these little roll pins. These are going to go all the way around the perimeter of our inner hub. These are what hold the steels from spinning. First plate that goes in is going to be the thin 1 millimeter. This is a nice setup. Usually on like Japanese bikes, they don't have this plate here, and the inner hub is aluminum, and that can wear out. Then you got to replace your inner hub. Now we're going to go with our first clutch plate. These are all the same, so you can just start stacking them in there. Now we'll go with a thicker plate, clutch plate, thicker plate, fiber, thick plate, fiber, thick plate, fiber, thick plate, fiber, and last thick plate, last fiber, and then we've got the last thin plate that goes on top. Then we can take our plate and toss it right in the trash. Easy. Next, we're going to bend over the locking tabs. I'm going to do that using a pair of channel locks. These can kind of be a pain in the ass. Okay, there's one. And there's the second one. I'm going to use a punch to flatten that nice and flush against the nut. We're going to put the clutch pusher in place. Before we do this, we're going to go to the other side of the engine and put a piece of tape on it. That's going to stop the push rod from falling through the engine. So we've got the push rod here, and then you've got the actual clutch pusher here. This is an assembled piece. It can be taken apart and pieces can be replaced though. You've got a small pancake bearing inside the actual clutch pusher itself. And there's a washer on this side and a small clip holding this all together. You want to make sure that that bearing is in good condition. I've already got a little bit of lubricant on here. Your push rod's going to snap in place. It can go either way. And we will just slide this in like so. And then next we've got the pressure plate. It's going to go on top. This doesn't go in any particular orientation. Slides in like that. Then we've got our clutch springs with the M6 bolts that hold them in place. It's a good idea to start these by hand, just so you don't cross thread them. These are all aluminum, and It's not that difficult to strip out the threads. Then I'm going to run them in with the impact driver, setting it at level 1. If you're using the Milwaukee, you do not want to tighten it down with this. This is just to run it in. Makes things a little faster. Okay, and these get tightened down to 7.4 foot-pounds of torque. All right, we're getting ready to put our clutch cover on. We're going to go ahead and put a brand new gasket on here. I like to grease my gaskets. It just helps with, it gives it a sealing effect. And then if you do have to pop off the cover, a lot of times you can actually reuse these gaskets. So although I do always recommend putting a new gasket on if you have the option. So we're going to go ahead and put this on our dowels. If I can orient this correctly, we've got 3 dowels. There's one up top, one in the front right here, and then a third one right here. Just pop that over there. That'll hold the gasket in place. Now I'll put our cover in place. There are a few seals here. You've got the water pump seal. There are 2 seals right here, 2 blue seals. These are the orientation that they go in. In the back, you've got a bearing in place. I'm gonna make sure that's in good condition. And we've also got another seal right here. This can come out. You've got a little retaining ring. You just pull that out, take a flat blade screwdriver, pry out the old seal, and then you can press in a new seal with your thumb, and then make sure to put that retaining ring back on there. Go ahead and pop this in place. You do want to put a little bit of lubricant on your water pump seal though. And we'll get this seal back here too. Now this will just slide in place. See if we can get that to hang on the dowels. Okay, there we go. Now for the clutch cover, you've got a rubber gasket that goes in a groove on the back. Mine may look a little bit different than yours because it's a recluse clutch cover, but for the most part, these go in the same way as the factory one. Once that gasket's in place, we can go ahead and mount our cover. And we'll put our hardware in place. It's a good idea to put anti-seize on these. You'll have one bolt that goes right here that gets a little copper washer. Now I'm first going to run all these in by hand, just to be careful not to cross-thread any of these. And the manual calls for 7.4 foot-pounds of torque. I'm going to go in a crisscross pattern as I tighten these down. Run our oil plug in with a fresh O-ring. Just snug that up by hand. Next, we're going to put the water pump on. We've got the impeller right here. It's a 2-piece design. They clip together, and then they will slide onto this shaft. And put a little bit of blue Loctite on here. And then we've got a cap nut that goes in place. And this gets tightened to 4.4 foot-pounds. Now we've got a rubber gasket that goes in place. It presses into this channel in the case, putting a little bit of grease on the gasket. And just make sure that's all the way down in the channel. You don't want this thing leaking. You want to make sure both of these dowel pins are in place. Then we're going to take our cover, pop it in place like that. We've got 2 long bolts that go on this side and 2 shorter bolts that go on this side. And this one down the bottom gets a copper washer. The manual calls for 7.4 pounds. I'm going to go to 7. All right, we're going to move to the stator side of the engine. We can peel this masking tape off because we don't have to worry about our clutch push rod popping out of place at this point. And we're going to come down to our starter gear and our flywheel. You want to inspect this and make sure that your one-way bearing works. To do that, we're going to spin on the gear, and you'll see it spins nice and freely in one direction, but it won't spin in the opposite. So that's how you know that that starter gear or the starter clutch is actually working. Sometimes they can still be bad. If they're on their way out, they might have enough to hold your hand tension, but when you get it in the engine, you might have an issue. But usually, if you can't do it by hand, you're good to go. So we'll take this gear. I'm going to put some lube on our crankshaft, and there is a needle bearing in there. Put that in place. Then we're going to put the starter idler gear in place. There is a gear on the back that's smaller. That's going to face towards our main starter gear. It's going to, let's put a little bit of lube on here. And this is going to slide right onto the case. Just spin it until it locks in place like so. Then we've got a washer and a screw. Putting a tiny amount of blue Loctite on here. And this is going to get tightened down to 7.4 foot-pounds of torque. I'm going to come down to the crank. You want to make sure this tapered shaft is in good condition. It's not scored up or anything. And it's good and clean. We're going to put a Woodruff key in our little slot here. These can be really tight tolerances, so you might have to tap it in place just gently. Okay, now we're going to take our flywheel, and you also want to make sure that you're good and clean where it's going to contact your tapered shaft. You can see there's a slot in here that's going to line up with the Woodruff key. We're just going to line it on up and slide it into place. You might have to twist it a little bit until you get it lined up. You may have to spin the gear in the back. There we go. And sometimes that helps it seat into that starter clutch. Next goes the bolt for the flywheel. The manual actually calls for this to be oiled. So we're going to put a little bit of oil on the threads, and then we'll run this in place. This gets tightened down to 51.6 pounds of torque. You can hold this with your hand and hit it with an impact, and you'll probably be good to go. If you want to torque it, we're going to use the holding method by the crank. So you're going to make sure that the crank is oriented in this position, so you got the downward stroke on the right side. And we're going to take a steel bar, put it through your crank rod hole, right like that, and that will hold this from going in the clockwise direction. You don't have to worry. These things can take a ton of force. Putting this 51.6 foot-pounds of torque on here isn't going to hurt anything. I'm going to take an extension and put it in the swing arm bolt hole. It's just going to give me a little bit of leverage because this thing is kind of fighting me moving around on the bench. Okay, then we'll just reverse the crank a little bit, pull out your rod, and we're good to go. Now we're going to come around up top. We're going to put the starter in place. Starter's got an O-ring up by the gears. You want to make sure you got a good O-ring on there. If you have one, definitely replace it. And this will pop in place. You might have to shimmy it a little bit, just get that O-ring to pop in there. Then we've got two bolts. These both get a little bit of anti-seize. And we'll tighten them down to 7.4 foot-pounds. Now I can put the torque limiter in place. This has a smaller gear on the back. Put a little bit of lube on our case. It slides in place like so. You might have to twist it around to get it to mesh up with the gears on your starter, and then again down here for the idler gear. And there we go. Now I'm going to grease up a fresh gasket. If you didn't see the clutch side of the engine, the reason I do this is because it has a sealing effect, and also when it comes time to remove the gasket, it makes it a lot easier. We've got two dowel pins. There's one at the bottom and one at the top. We're going to hang the gasket right on those dowel pins. Before we put our stator cover on, there is a little bit of assembly that we have to do. First thing is going to be this little oil jet. It goes right here. It's a little brass oil jet. The size is 60. It goes right in here. You got to be really careful with these. They're soft, and the flat top head can strip really easily. So the manual calls for Loctite. I am not going to put Loctite on this. Just going to screw this in and just snug it down. And you do want to make sure that that oil passage is good and clear. You can see it comes out to this side. So we're actually going to put a plug in this side as well. It's just a little set screw. Same thing with this. I'm just going to snug this down. Next, we'll drop the stator in place. We're going to put it with the wire in the back towards the top. We'll line this up. Run this wire in between where the pickup coil goes. We're going to take our grommet and tuck it into place for right now. We've got 3 bolts for the back of the stator. I'm putting a very low strength Loctite on here. You could probably put a little bit of medium if you wanted to, but these don't need to be super tight. If you're going to torque these down, they go to 4.4 foot-pounds of torque. I'm just going to snug them down by hand. Now we can put the pickup in place. Just make sure your wires are tucked in the back here and you're not pinching anything. This kind of pops in place. It can't really be moved around or adjusted. Then we've got a wire guide that goes on top. We're going to fish it in like so. And again, make sure you're not pinching any of your wires. You can see that kind of holds the wires off to the side like so. I've already got a small amount of low strength Loctite on our hardware. These also go to 4.4 foot-pounds. And again, with these, I'm just going to snug them up. And then just double check, make sure that none of your wires are pinched or anything. Ours looks good to go. Now we can go ahead, drop our stator cover in place. Oh, geez. The magnetism there is pretty strong. Caught me off guard. I'm just gonna twist this until it lines up onto our dowel pins. And I think we're good and flush. And just like with all of our other case bolts, I've got anti-seize on all of these. And the stator side is nice and easy. These are all the same length bolts. Just running these in, making sure that the gasket is lined up before we tighten anything down. The manual calls for 7.4 foot-pounds. I'm going to go to 7 foot-pounds. And we're going to go in a crisscross pattern as we tighten these down. We've got our plug that goes in the front. You want to make sure you got a fresh O-ring on the back of this, otherwise you might have some leaks. And I'm just going to thread this in by hand for now because we're going to have to take this back off to do the top end. If I was tightening it down, I would just do it nice and snug by hand. We're going to go ahead and put our clutch slave cylinder in place. It's going to go right here. First thing I'm going to do is put some grease on our gasket, and the grease should have enough tack to hold this in place. Like so. Now I'll put the actual slave cylinder in place. This one may look a little bit different than yours. It's a Recluse, so this is an aftermarket, but it's going to go together pretty much the same as the OEM one. You're going to have a plunger in here. This one has 2 O-rings for the aftermarket. And we're going to take a little bit of this Molykote. It's a lubricant that goes on the seals. Just make sure everything has got some lubricant on there. Then we're going to press this in place with the ball bearing facing towards you or outward. And we're just going to gently push this in place. You don't want to pinch your seals. So just take your time pushing this in. Make sure that you don't shear the seals off. Okay, there we go. Just push that in place like so. Then we've got an O-ring. I'm going to put a little bit of lubricant on it. The O-ring sits around the outside of the slave cylinder, and it's meant to go in the groove all the way at the bottom, not in this groove up here. There's no O-ring that goes in that groove up there. Now we can just drop this in place. Get it lined up with our bolt holes. And we've got 2 bolts at the bottom, little shorties, and I did put some anti-seize on these. And then for this Recluse unit, there is a longer bolt at the top. Maybe the same one for the factory slave cylinder also. Now, if you're going to use the OEM chain guard, it does utilize this one bolt hole, so you'll have to pop that out, then put the chain guard on and put a longer bolt through if you're going to go with the OEM orientation. I'm going to torque these to 7 foot-pounds. And for the Recluse, there is an adjusting nut that goes in the front. There's 2 O-rings on here. If you are using one of these kits, you want to make sure those O-rings are good to go. And I'm going to put a little bit of the Molykote on here. Just lube up the O-rings, and then this will push right in the front. Same thing with the plunger on the other side. You don't want to shear off these O-rings. Then this gets adjusted after the fact. I'm just going to run it in until it's flush with the housing. And just for organization, I'm going to thread our banjo bolt in the top. Then right below that is our gear position sensor. This is going to go right here like so. There is a guard that goes on top. And you've got 2 bolts. These call for Loctite, so I've got a little bit of blue Loctite on these. These get tightened down to 4.4 foot-pounds. I'm just snugging them down. Now we can put our sprocket in place. We've got this brand new Dirt Trick sprocket here in bronze. Pretty sweet looking. We're just going to line it up with our splines. There is a raised portion that's going to face towards the engine. Just pop that on like there. And then we've got a special bolt. You can see it's got a little collar or shoulder on the inside. And then we've got a concave washer. You want to face it with the cup facing towards the engine. This is going to slide onto the bolt, and it pops right into place like that. I'm going to put some red thread lock on this. And I'm going to use the clutch holding tool to hold the sprocket from spinning. And this gets torqued to 44.3 pounds. And then one last thing to cap off the bottom end, there's a bolt that goes in the bottom here. We're going to have to remove this. It is a way to check for top dead center. So for now, I'm just going to thread this in place. You can see there's a thick copper washer that goes in the back. All right, we're going to move into the top end. Depending on what piston you have, or if you're using OEM, it might look a little bit different. This is a brand new Wassner piston. It is stock specifications. You can see it's a nice billet aluminum piston. Wassner makes excellent pistons, very high quality. Now, no matter what piston you have, it's going to be pretty much the same procedure. First thing you want to do is check your ring end gap. This Wassner only utilizes one main ring. So we're going to place it in the cylinder, just right towards the top, about 1/2 of an inch down from the top of the cylinder. And then to make that nice and flush in the cylinder, we're going to put the piston in, push it up, and that will make it nice and flush. Now what we're measuring is the little gap in between the piston ring ends. You don't want them to be too tight, because as the engine heats up, they will expand and they'll actually butt up against each other, and it can cause engine damage. So a typical rule of thumb is 4/1000 per inch of diameter of your bore. So this bore is right around 3.5 inches. So 3 inches would be 12 thousandths, plus another 1/2 inch would be 14 thousandths. So we want to be in the 14 thousandths range. We're going to take a feeler gauge here, and these things fan out, and they've got all different sizes on here. So you want to find the size that you're looking for. And what you're looking for is just a small amount of drag on the feeler gauge. So this one is in spec. Now we'll put the rings on the piston. If you're using an aftermarket piston, they typically come with instructions. Like this Wassner one here, you can see they have an actual layout of how they want you to set the rings. You should go by what the manufacturer suggests. If you're using an OEM piston, then of course use the OEM service manual. So I'm going to set this up the way that Wassner has it. First thing we're going to put in place is the oil expander. You want to make sure that the ends are butted up against each other like this once they're on the piston, and that they're not overlapping like this, because you'll have issues if you do that. So once again, you just want them butting up against each other. So this will go on our piston. Wassner wants the end up in this corner. Again, depending on what brand of piston you have, it may be different. Then we've got the lower oil ring and the upper oil ring will go with the gap on the opposite corner. Now we'll put the top ring in place. Now, depending on what brand you have, you may have a different marking, but typically whichever side of the ring has a marking on it or a letter, that's going to be the top. And you can see this one is marked with a T, and this one is going to be, looks like in this top corner is where the ring end goes. So it'll slide in place like so. I'm also going to take one of our piston clips and put it in place on the bench. It's going to make installation just a little bit easier. When you do these rings, you want the opening to be at the top or at the bottom. That's just a rule of thumb. And the way that I do the one on the bench, the way I like to do it anyways, is by pushing it in sideways. See if I can get you guys in here. It's kind of hard to see. Push it in sideways like that. And then we will rotate it and snap it in place. All right, I think we got it. You just want to make sure that it's all the way seated in that groove. This one looks good. All right, now we're going to go ahead and put the piston in place. You want to make sure that the arrow is facing forward. Most pistons are going to have an arrow. If it doesn't, these smaller cutouts for the valves go forward. You can see there's larger cutouts in the back. I've got a little cap filled with the motor oil that I'm going to be using. I'm going to put a little bit of lubricant on our wrist pin. Then we'll put the piston over top of our rod, and we're going to slide the piston pin through the rod like so. Now this second one can get kind of tricky. I have it set on this side of the engine because over here we'd be dealing with the cam chain and stuff that'd be getting in the way. So first thing I'm going to do is take a rag and stuff our crank, so that way if the piston clip falls in, we'll at least have a fighting chance of getting it out of there, because if it drops in the case, it could be a nightmare getting that thing out of there. So we're going to go ahead and put it in. And again, you want the opening to be facing at the 12 o'clock or the 6 o'clock position. And we're just going to go for it here and see if we can get it in there. This one's pretty tough. I got to get up close and personal with this thing. And it is a good idea to have safety glasses on when you do this, because I've actually had these things fly out and hit me right in the freaking eye. Whew. All right. That one was kind of a pain in the ass, but you just want to make sure that you're completely clipped all the way in the groove. Otherwise, you could have some major problems. Now, believe it or not, according to the service manual, they actually want you to put the piston in the cylinder first and then put the whole assembly down while putting the piston clips on with the cylinder, and I just think that would be not easy. Maybe there's some special tools for it or something. Anyways, well, I'm going to take some of the engine oil that we're using. I'm going to rub it all on the inside of our cylinder. Oh, I almost forgot to remove our rag. And we're going to take that same oil and put it on the skirt of our piston. We're going to put our base gasket in place. I highly recommend using name brand gaskets. This one came right from Wassner. It's what they recommend for their piston kit. We're going to slide this in place. You want to make sure it's oriented correctly. There are also 2 dowel pins, one in the back and one in the front. You want to make sure that they're in place and ready to go. We're going to fish our timing chain through and our guides, and then we will slide this gasket over top of our studs. Get our piston out of the way here, and just place it right on our dowel pins. Now, if you're going to follow the KTM manual, they want you to put a small amount of sealant on the back and on the front where the cases meet. I like to do my base gaskets dry, so we're not going to do any of that, but I did want to mention that in case you want to follow the manual procedures. Now we're going to do our cylinder. We'll slide it over our cam chain and our cam chain sliders. This can be a little bit cumbersome. Get it over our studs. And we're going to take our piston rings and compress them by hand. There is a special tool to do this, but you can get the job done with your fingers. And this is not easy. You really want to take your time with this because you can actually damage the rings if you force it. I think we're good. Give this a couple light taps to get it to seat on those dowel pins. I think we're good. Next thing to go in place is going to be our cylinder head. This is a brand new cylinder head that I got from Scott Powersports. The failure on this particular engine was a faulty oil pump system. As you saw, those gears were messed up and the top end was destroyed. So this is a brand new cylinder head. I've already assembled it. If you want to see how to assemble it, there are other videos on YouTube that show that. But you want to make sure that your head is in good condition and it's in spec. If it's something that you're not willing to tackle, you can send it to Powersports Nation and they will rebuild your head and completely service it for you. One of the things that I did want to point out though, if you are doing your own work on your cylinder head, these little cam levers that come up, I couldn't find any indication in the service manual or online. It was really difficult to find, and then I finally found it basically verifying from OEM pictures, and there's one of them that's different. So you have these 3 are all the same. So if it's facing this way, you can see that this one here is just a little bit wider. So if you're holding the cylinder with the opening for your cam chain in the bottom, it's going to be the one on the bottom right that is the special one. So just make sure to keep that in mind before you assemble your cylinder head. Before we put the cylinder head on, we've got 2 dowels to put in place. I'm putting a little bit of anti-seize on these, just getting it around the outside. That's just going to help when it comes for time for disassembly. It will slide down. We've got 2 of them in the back of the cylinder. Just going to slide these in place and push them until they're seated. And the second one. Then I've got a brand new metal gasket. You definitely want to put a new head gasket on here, and I always recommend using a high quality. You want to make sure it's oriented correctly as well. You just match it up with the top of your cylinder and you can't go wrong. The one side is a little bit further forward than the other side. Slide this over our cam chain. This is going to go on dry. Get it over top of our studs and whatnot. Now once you put the head on there, we're going to be putting the cylinder nuts in place. The manual calls for some motor oil on these threads. It's going to be easier to oil these threads now because once the cylinder head is on there, they're kind of down in there and it's a little bit difficult to get to. Just put a little bit of motor oil on these threads. And then once you get this little one back here too, but I got a little bit of anti-seize on it instead of motor oil. All right, we're just gonna double check, make sure our cylinder head is all clean and good to go. And we're gonna put this thing in place, fish our cam chain through, and just line everything up. That went on nice and easy. All right, now inside we've got our studs, and you can see why I wanted to oil them. They're pretty difficult to get to. You want to put your washers in place. Using a pair of needle nose might help you out, or even a magnet possibly. So both of those are in place, and then we'll spin our nuts in place. I've kind of used a socket here to help me out. And you've got these two on the outside that are a little bit easier to get to. We're going to do 3 passes on these head nuts. The first one is going to be 7.4 foot-pounds, then it's going to be 22.1 foot-pounds, and then I believe the third is 36.9 foot-pounds. We're going to go in a diagonal pattern, and the engine is going to want to spin on you, so if you have it on the bench. I like to do the swing arm bolt method. Just take this is an extension or any steel bar, put it through where your swing arm goes. It's just going to give you something to hold on to, and it helps you tighten if you don't have a buddy to like hold the engine or something like that. And the other thing is, as you're tightening these down, the entire time, anytime you're using a torque wrench, you always want to grip at the handle. If you grip anywhere else, that changes the leverage of the action, and you'll actually get an inaccurate torque reading. So the first one is going to be 7.4 foot-pounds. This one we won't really need too much. Already there on that one. Already there. Okay. And last one. Next is 22.1 pounds. And last but not least, 36.9 foot-pounds. And we'll just double check all these, make sure they're good. All right, and then we'll spin our engine around, and we've got the washer and a small nut. And again, I've got a little bit of anti-seize on that stud. If you want to tighten this to torque, it goes to 7.4 foot-pounds. I've got a pretty good feel for this, so I'm just going to do the old hand ugga-dugga. We should be good right there. All right, now we're going to remove our timing plug. Get that out of the way. In order to put the cams in correctly, we need to get the engine to top dead center. So we can now put a wrench on to the crank, and we can turn the engine over. So we're going to spin the engine around, and if you guys remember, there is a little bolt in the front here. That's going to show us where top dead center is. This is the bolt right here. Just going to pop that out of place. That might be kind of difficult to actually show you this in real time because it's really kind of dark in there. So basically I'm going to be turning the engine over in a counterclockwise fashion and finding top dead center. There is a small slot on your crankshaft, and it will pass that little inspection window right there. And once it's lined up with the inspection window, that's how you know you're at top dead center. I'm actually at top dead center right now, so I'm just going to go ahead and roll the engine so that it's no longer at top dead center. And as we're doing this, we want to take our timing chain and put a little bit of tension on it, because if you don't do that, it's going to bind up on your gears and the engine is not going to turn. So we'll just go ahead and turn the engine over. This is good to do anyways, just to make sure that everything's good in the engine. If it's not turning over smoothly, you know something's not right. Okay, so we're definitely not at top dead center anymore, or if we are, we've gone all the way around. So now let's go ahead and look at our window. So that's the inspection window right there. And as I turn the crank over, you should be able to see it moving in there. And I'll show you what we're looking for. I'm going to try my best to keep this steady. You can see it. Oh, I think that's it right there, actually. Right there. That's perfect. So right there is right on the money, and that's what we're looking for. Now that we're at top dead center, we're going to take that same bolt and we're going to put it back in place. You want to make sure it's the OEM bolt and that it has this little taper at the end. If you're using hardware that's not original, you probably don't want to do this. But that little taper is going to go right into the groove on the crank. It'll only do that, though, if we remove this thick copper washer. That's going to allow it to go in just a little bit further and prevent the crank from turning. And we're just doing this for setting the cams. Otherwise, you want to leave that this thick washer in there because it'll be dragging on the crankshaft and your engine probably won't turn over. This doesn't have to be tight. I'm just kind of snugging it down. Now we're going to put our shims in place. If you're putting in the same shims that you took out, you want to put them back in the same position that you found them. And then you can go back and check later to make sure they're still in spec. They're going to go underneath these little cam levers. And they press right into the top of our valve springs. There's a little recession that they clip into. So I'm going to go ahead and lift the rest of these up. All right, and then we just drop all the levers back down. Now we're going to put our cams in place. Before we do that, I'm going to take a little bit of assembly lube and put it in all of the little channels that the cam is going to ride in. And I'll also put some lube on the camshaft itself. We've got our intake and we've got our exhaust camshaft. The intake camshaft has a larger hole in the front, and the exhaust side has the decompression mechanism built right into it. So that's how you can differentiate the two. The other thing to take note of is that both of these cams have a little strike mark, and at least these brand new ones these are KTM OEM, they have a little red dot. But as long as they have that little strike mark, you want them facing each other, and they're going to be parallel with this portion of the case. We're going to start with the intake cam, and it does have a plastic bleeder that slides in the back, and it's going to face upward like this. When you put the cam in, it's going to slide right into this channel in the back. Pop that in like that. I grab my timing chain with a magnet. Then it's good to give the chain a couple tugs to get it to set into the groove of the lower gear. So we'll put with the intake first, and I'm going to try to do it lined up with that little strike mark again, set with the cylinder head. It can be a little tedious, especially with the freaking camera. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. You can always adjust it. Now I'll come in with the exhaust camshaft. Fish this in here. Same thing, lining that little strike mark up with the edge of our cylinder head. And I think I got it. That looks pretty good. And you want to double check, make sure that your bleeder is located correctly. As you can see, mine is not. So we're just going to lift up the back of the cam a little bit, twist it, and it fits into a little groove in the case. Now I'm going to put the cam bridge in place. You want to make sure that you've got some lubricant where it contacts the cam. And there's also 4 dowels, one on each corner. Just want to make sure that they're in place. This will get placed right on top of your cams, and just gently, it kind of like clips in place. Go easy with it. Then we've got 8 bolts. These are all the same length, and the manual does call for a little bit of motor oil on the threads, which I've already gone ahead and done. And then in the middle, we've got this cam chain slider. Just going to run these in with the impact, not tightening them down. This is just a lot quicker. Now I'm going to torque these down to 10.3 foot-pounds. We're going to start in the middle and then work our way outwards. With the bridge tightened down and at top dead center, you can go ahead and check your valve clearances. On the intake side, you're looking for 0.1 millimeters to 0.15 millimeters. You just take your feeler gauge and run it under the lobes. Make sure that they're correct. And on the exhaust side, you're looking for 0.13 millimeters to 0.18 millimeters. You're going to slide that right under here. If your clearance is incorrect, it's no big deal. You just got to take the cams off and then take those little shims out that are on top of the valves. And those valves are interchangeable with different heights. And as you adjust the heights of the shims, that will change your clearances. I'm not going to have a tutorial on how to adjust that in this video, but there are videos on YouTube showing how to do that. I've already got mine in spec, so let's move forward. And then, of course, don't forget to put that copper washer back on your inspection bolt. And remember, it's this extra thick one, which is necessary so that you clear the crankshaft. This will go in place. And this gets torqued down to 7.4. It's a good idea now to check, make sure your engine turns over. Now I can put the timing plug back in. If you don't have an Allen wrench this big, it's no problem. You can take something like this. I believe this is an M10. As long as it has a 14 millimeter head, you can use this to tighten down that timing plug. And this doesn't need to go very tight. Just enough that that O-ring will seal. You don't want to have any oil leaks. That's essentially all this is an oil plug. Okay. Next thing we're going to put in place is the cam chain tensioner. That's going to go right in here. Before we do that, though, we have to compress this. Apparently, a lot of people dread putting this in, but it's really not that difficult. So I'm just going to show you how this works and how to set it so that we can get it in there correctly. So this is like a spring-loaded piston. I'll show you. It goes up and down. It is really tense. You can see it moves up and down, and those little notches, it has like little stages to self-adjust. So, and you can see it will hold itself like this as well. If yours is already in that clamped position, the way that you release it is by pushing down and releasing quickly. So you got to put a good bit of pressure on these. See, that'll release it like so. Now, in the manual, they want you to leave about 3 millimeters at the bottom. Now, you can adjust it with your palm. If you go all the way down to the bottom, it's going to reset and spring back out. If you go gently, you can stop it right about there, and that's how it needs to be installed. Some people struggle to do that, so what they do is they'll take an object, you reset this, they'll take an object like this washer, which is about the right height, and you just put it up against the side, and when you compress down, it's going to stop against the rest of the tensioner. And basically, it's supposed to prevent you from pushing all the way down so that it stops like that. Seems a little bit daunting, but it's really not that hard to do. We're going to go in with the flat side facing inward, and there is an O-ring that goes on here. It's a good idea to put a fresh one in place. We're just going to slide this in like so. And then we've got the pressure plate. You want to put a brand new copper washer on the back end, and this will just spin into place. This gets tightened down to 29 foot-pounds. Now with this tightened up, we can release the tensioner so that it puts tension on the timing chain. If you take, I'm going to take a little T-handle right here and press in the open hole, and you can see the cam chain moving in there. That's because it's not decompressed. So to decompress that, I'm just going to put force on the tensioner, and that will, if you could hear it there, it actually released. And now if you look in here, when I press in the Allen key, there's no movement at all. And you can feel your cams and timing chain. And as you can see, this one is good and tight, so we know we're good. And then there's a little cap that goes in place. There is an O-ring on there. You want to make sure you got a fresh O-ring in this. And we'll just thread this in place. And I'm just going to snug this down. Next, I'm going to put the exhaust flange in place. It has a paper-style gasket. I'm putting some grease on it. And the exhaust flange does have a contour to it. I've discovered on mine, they look almost the same, but there's a small part number on top of the flange. I've noticed on mine that it matches up nicer with the part number on bottom. So I don't know if that's the correct way to put it or if it just happens to be that way with this particular engine. But that's the way I'm going to put it. The gasket just slides right on the back. Then the flange will slide in place. Then there's two M6 bolts, and I've got anti-seize on both of these. These will get torqued to 7.4 foot-pounds. Now I'll come around back and put the intake boot in place. I like to put a little bit of dielectric grease on the inner lip. It kind of acts as a lubricant. And this does have a little portion here that lines up with this spot on the cylinder head. And this will literally just clip in place. Then on the inside, we've got a 63 millimeter hose clamp. Just snug that down. And then on the outside, you've got a 58 millimeter. And then on the side here, we've got our thermostat. I'm going to put a fresh O-ring in our little groove. I've got a little bit of anti-seize on this, just so it doesn't get seized. I'll spin this in place. And this, I'm just going to snug down by hand. This can be kind of tricky to see. We're going to put our spark plug tube in place. There are two O-rings that go in here. Right now, they're not in there. You see this empty groove right here, and then there's another one down here. You're gonna have an O-ring that fits in each of those grooves. So you wanna lube up 2 brand new O-rings and put them in place first. These will kind of clip in place right in the grooves. There's one, and the second one's a little bit lower. Okay. Then we've got our spark plug tube, putting a little bit of grease on the outside so that it can slip in between those O-rings that we just popped in there. And I'm just gently pushing that in place. It kind of snaps in place. The O-rings hold it nice and tight. Next we have a gasket that goes around our spark plug ring. We'll take a little bit of grease and put it on the gasket. And that will slide right in place right here. Now we're going to put our cam cover in place, and the rubber gasket is going to get the same treatment as the last gasket. I like to put a little bit of grease around the edges. The only place where I'm not going to put grease is where these little half moons are. We're going to be putting some sealant in those areas. This grease just kind of helps the gasket not get stuck for when you have to remove it, in case you have to adjust your valves if you're going to shim them or something. And this gasket just kind of clips in place into the channel on your cam cover. Now we'll come to the little areas where those half moons go in the cylinder head. We'll take a little bit of Yumabond 6B or whatever sealant you prefer and just put a very thin amount in these half moons. Trying not to make a mess here. If you get any on the outside, like right there, and you want to clean it off, I recommend waiting for it to dry and then get it later. Oh man, we're getting close. Now we can pop the cam cover in place. It just drops straight on, like so. And then we've got these 3 special bolts with a shoulder. And I do recommend putting a little bit of anti-seize on these. And there are sealing washers that go underneath. And you'll see how they have a stepped ridge. The smaller step faces upward and will pop right onto your shoulder bolt like so, and then just spin these in place. These get tightened down to 5.9 foot-pounds. And last but not least, we'll put in a brand new spark plug. The manual suggests 0.8 millimeters for your gap, or about 31 thousandths. So you just want to go ahead and measure, make sure that you've got the appropriate spark plug gap. I'm going to be putting a little bit of anti-seize on this. Drop her in place, do our best not to drop the spark plug. It does go in there pretty far. All right, this will get tightened down to 8.9 foot-pounds. And with that, my friends, you've built yourselves a KTM 350 XCF engine. Good job. Thanks for making it this far into the video. If there's one final thing I can leave you with, it's to take your time in your engine build. A lot of times when you're watching these videos, it can seem really easy, and when you're doing it on your own, it can be a complete struggle. Just take your time, refer to the service manual, and go back and rewatch portions of this video that you need to, and you will be able to get the job done. If something isn't fitting right and you're getting frustrated, it might be time to take a break and then come back to it. If you enjoyed the video in any way, shape, or form, or it helped you out, please consider giving the video a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. I put a lot of work into these videos, and hitting the like button helps me out tremendously. If you're interested in seeing the restoration of this bike from start to finish, make sure to check out the series. It's a really good one. All right, guys, thanks again for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.
Man, that over rev, you gotta twist that throttle all the way.